and my pleasure will be today to try to introduce to you how the restitution process is going on in Serbia, with a special attention to restitution of the Jewish property. Here in front of me I have some data about the restitution of the Jewish property, so whoever from the crowd is interested can pick it up. So in the territory that is now Republic of Serbia, which in the eve of the beginning of World War II represented part of the territory of much larger state, Kingdom of Yugoslavia, had lived more than 30,000 Jews, of which unfortunately more than 80% were killed during the Holocaust. The leadership of Kingdom of Yugoslavia, which was deeply shaken by internal secessionist tendencies after the assassination of the king Aleksandar Karađorđević, signed the pact with Nazis. But 3 days after signing the pact, military coup occurred, and the consequence was Hitler's ordering German military action against Yugoslavia. The action resulted with occupation of Yugoslavia by Nazis and Axis puppet states, such as independent state of Croatia. Serbia was torn apart and divided on pieces. City of Belgrade was under the command of Nazis and whistling Milan Nedić, and parts of Serbia, Bačka, Srem, and Banat, Kosovo and Metohija were under command of Hungarians, Croats, local Germans, and Italians. Depending on occupied area, the methodology of confiscation of Jewish property during Holocaust, during World War II, was different. So in area of occupied Belgrade, Nazi authorities had adopted the regulation on Jews and Gypsies, which served as a ground for confiscation of all Jewish property. And that robbery has been written in official land registers. In occupied area under control of Hungarians, in land register were written notes if the property is Jewish. While in the area under control of independent state of Croatia, the special acts of confiscation of Jewish properties were adopted and served as a ground for the implementation in land registers. Liberating the country from Nazis, new authorities annulled all the acts of confiscation brought by Nazis, including the acts of confiscation of Jewish property, which was returned in 1945 to survived family members, if there were any. After that, just after the war, as a consequence of now new ideology of new authorities, began the seizure of agricultural land from persons who owned the land above a certain maximum. And so in practice of the agency, we noticed cases where the property which was just returned to the Holocaust survivors was seized only a few months after, this time as a consequence of other ideology, and that seizure of property was implemented to all Yugoslav citizens, regardless to their nationality or religion. After 1946, more than 40 different laws on seizure of the property were adopted. Jewish property was the subject of significant confiscation because of the Jews' departure from Yugoslavia to Israel, and because of that, they lost Yugoslav citizenship. And the loss of the Yugoslav citizenship was taken as a special ground for confiscation of the property. Objects of nationalization between 1946 and 1968 were all types of property: agricultural land, forests and forest land, factories, companies, apartments, stores, construction land. The restitution process in Serbia had been implemented in several legislative waves, similar like in Czech Republic, from 1991 to 2016. After the introduction of multi-party democratic political system, various governments have changed, and almost every single one passed some restitution laws. So the first law that was regarding restitution of agricultural land was passed in 1991, and it enabled restitution of a large part of agricultural land. The law on restitution of property to churches and religious communities was enacted in 2006, and this law made it possible for churches and religious communities to get 100% of taken property. The general law on property restitution and compensation was passed in 2011, and the legislative frame in Serbia was rounded up with a special law on restitution of Jewish property with no legal heirs, so Jewish property with no legal successors. And if we are talking about the general law, 2011, main principle of this law is restitution in kind. but restitution in kind is possible only if the claimed property is today in a regime of public property, state property, so in a regime of property of state of Serbia or local authorities. If that is not the case, the Republic of Serbia, by the law, has created a special fund of 2 billion euros for compensation. The important thing of this law is that it does not make any kind of discrimination, nor does any kind of discrimination exist in its implementation. And the best example for this assertion is demonstrated in fact that it enables restitution of property to foreign citizens, just under the condition of reciprocity. The agency of restitution, which on this conference here is represented also by General Director Mr. Sekulic, is a Serbian government law enforcement agency that was established in 2012 in order to process procedures and decisions on claim for property restitution and compensation, implementation of restitution of property of churches and religious communities, and restitution of Jewish property on grounds of the 2006 special law. The agency has received more than 80,000 claims and so far has resolved more than 60% of all cases. Until this moment, the agency has restituted in kind overall, except the restitution to churches and religious communities. So this is restitution. I'm talking now about the restitution to physical persons, families. Restituted in kind 4,152 business premises, more than 800 apartments, almost 900 buildings, which in total makes it 5,806 premises with total surface of almost 500,000 square meters. The agency has also returned to former owners and their legal heirs almost 3 million square meters of construction land, more than 22,000 hectares of agricultural land, and almost 5,000 hectares of forests and forest land, which makes it overall about 2 billion euro worth restituted in property in kind. In accordance with the law on property restitution and compensation, so this 2006 general law, property was restituted also to Jewish families, so Holocaust survivors that today live in Serbia and mostly abroad, Israel, USA, Canada, Great Britain. And so far are restituted 82 stores, 12 buildings, 10 apartments, in total surface around 10,000 square meters. 100,000 square meters of construction land and 861 hectares of agricultural land. In accordance with the law on restitution of property to churches and religious communities, which allows 100% restitution, to the Jewish communities were restituted 31 hectares of land and almost 9 square meters of buildings, which represents around 90% of all claimed land area from Jewish communities and 67.42% of total surface, that is surface of objects that is claimed by Jewish communities in Serbia. And now finally, in accordance with the 2016 special law that was passed last year, in just 1 year, the agency restituted to Jewish communities 39 stores, 7 flats, 1 garage, and 1 building with total surface of more than 10,000 square meters and 400 hectares of agricultural land. Mr. Sekulic and me were members of working group that was formed by the government of Republic of Serbia that was in charge with working on the special law. And I'm proud to say that this working group was in session for a few years, and in February 2006 the special law was enacted with maximal support of the Serbian government and by National Assembly of the Republic of Serbia without a single vote against. The resistance in public was not present in any form. The law adopted all principles of the Terezin Declaration. It represents codification in the area of restitution of Jewish property. This law makes it possible to restitute all Jewish property that was confiscated between 1941, so property that was confiscated at the start of World War II, until the property that was taken up to year 1968. This law empowers the restitution in kind wherever it is possible, and the Republic of Serbia has determined financial support in amount of 950,000 euro annually in next 25 years as expression of solidarity with Jewish people. So far, experience has shown that all the claims of Jewish communities according to this law can be solved in next 3 years, having this process irretrievably completed. This law clearly indicates that the Republic of Serbia and Serbian people, although cannot be responsible for the Holocaust in any way, because themselves have been victims of Nazi regime, in this way are trying to eliminate as much as it is possible at least the property consequences of the Holocaust. There is absolutely no need for any state, any city, town or municipality to be the owner of the property whose real owners were killed in the Holocaust. The Holocaust as major consequence had immense loss of human lives, but it also had a hidden motive, an outrageous robbery of the Jewish property. The Serbian experience has shown that very significant for the restitution process has been the unselfish support of the State Department in the form of the Special Envoy for the Holocaust issues, as well as embassies of USA and Israel, churches, religious communities, and non-governmental sector. The excuse is saying that restitution is impossible because of the time that passed, or a lack of documentation, or objective lack of money for complete restitution, are not and cannot be the reason for not implementing the restitution process. We are absolutely sure if the country as Serbia could carry out the restitution process, richer countries would be able to do so. If we are talking about the positive effects of successful restitution process, Serbian example shows that restitution has positive impact on public finances. It is undoubtedly confirmed that each square meter of returned property is bringing bigger long-term and stable income to the central, state, and local authorities' budgets. It has also important anti-corruption and anti-monopolist effect. The restitution is the process which is efficiently and quickly removing enormous incomes from the handful of privileged people, monopolists, and even organized crime members that use public property. The biggest strength of the privileged monopolists and usurpators of the public property is actually based in the fact of undisturbed control and usurpation of real estate that belongs to state or municipalities. The restitution process, because of its nature, have identified the legal actions with public property in the period of past 30 years, particularly after 1990. The power of the restitution process is to unveil the illegal acts after so many years and to publicly unmask and correct the consequences by transfer of the hidden state property, we call it cloudy property, into the private property of former owners. Undisputed and safe rights to real estate have been established to the restitution. The investors are getting possibility of free investments in the restituted real estate. Furthermore, there is a message to the future authorities, it's very important, that enforced dispossession as a form of establishment of totalitarian regime with the monopoly over real estate must not be repeated again. More than 10 families in Serbia got the chance to work with their property to become self-employed or to employ other persons without the increase of public debt, like providing the subventions for employment from the budget. Furthermore, the real estate for restitution is safe, while other real estate which are being acquired from the state on any way, local authorities or public companies are burdened by the control of politicians and political parties. So the conclusion of my speech could be that Republic of Serbia, although not yet a member of EU and belongs to poorer European countries, should represent a role model in the property restitution area and especially in restitution of Jewish property. Thanks.
Good afternoon. The importance of this effort that I will describe in a moment is for Israel, the state of the Jewish people, to have a clean slate before it goes and approaches other countries for restitution, for Jewish restitution. So here is the Israeli model. What will we be talking about? The need for Holocaust restitution in Israel, why was it necessary at all? Parliamentary Inquiry Committee, unique comprehensive legislation, a restitution entity, time frame, restitution activities, in general, or in summary, the Israeli model, and the story of the Peter Shechman story, who is an Australian citizen. So what was the need? Well, Jewish people before World War II bought property in Israel. They bought property, they put money in Israeli banks for different reasons. They bought shares and other financial assets. In the year 2000, a parliamentary inquiry committee was established. As always, you need a trigger, and the trigger was a book. The book written by Professor Yossi Katz, Rechush Shenishkach, in Hebrew, Forgotten Property. It was published in the year 2000. Later, Professor Katz received the highest reward, Israel prize for his lifetime achievement. The parliamentary committee was initiated by Ms. Coletta Vital. She was a member of the Knesset, a member of the Israeli parliament at that time. Nowadays, she is the president of the Center of Organizations of Holocaust Survivors in Israel. So it was established in the year 2000. It submitted its final report, though, only in 2005. In between, they submitted a couple of interim reports, and the inquiry was focused at Israeli banks who held assets of Holocaust victims. The result of the report was unique legislation. This legislation was called the Law for Holocaust Victims' Assets. It was created in conjunction with Holocaust organizations in Israel. Those organizations were later represented ongoingly in management of that law. And the ministry that was put in charge of the law was the Ministry of Justice. An interesting component that exists in this law is an interest revaluation committee, which created mandatory revaluation formulas. And that means that each asset, when it was brought forward to nowadays prices, nowadays value, it was done in a uniform form. There was no luck there. It was done properly and uniformly. So, a restitution entity was established by the law, and it was a non-for-profit governmental company. It was established immediately after the submission of the report and the passing of the law in the year 2006 for a period of 15 years, and it had and it has an appeals committee. That's the company that was established, Hashava, the Holocaust Restitution Company of Israel. The appeals committee contains a retired judge, a professor, knowledgeable in restitution and the history of restitution, and a lawyer. So, what was there? They found 60,000 various assets such as real estate, which means apartments, buildings, land plots, subdivided plots, art, and financial. Bank accounts, shares and bonds, different kind of monies, and contents of safes that were held in the Israeli banks. So what were the restitution activities? First of all, a list of names was published on the website. 60,720 names were published by the company. They are still on the website in 5 languages: Hebrew, English, Russian, German, and French. And what the company is emphasizing, and they emphasize to me as well, their most important achievement was active outreach for allocation of owners. They say that without that active outreach, which we'll see in a moment in the Australian story, nothing would happen, or very little would happen. People don't know, people forget, people are not aware. So they received 12,000 claims. Apparently what they did was probably right, because there were only 250 appeals and no lawsuits. Their team was and is highly skilled. So that's how the list of assets, that's the enter to the list of assets as it appears on the website. Time frame. The law established the closure of the company by December, 15 years, but the company is going to be closed after 11 years in December 2017, because they came to the conclusion that there is no point of holding it any longer. They restituted 700 million shekels, or $200 million worth of assets, and about $285 million were given for Holocaust survivors' needs, which means that they sold heirless property and it was devoted for Holocaust survivors. So a total of close to $500 million will be allocated by the end of this year. The law and the decision of the company is that whatever is going to be left, most probably they estimated it about $30 million worth of assets by the end of this year. It will be for assisting survivors' needs, educational projects for commemoration of the Holocaust and commemoration. So what is the Israeli model? What does it contain? A parliamentary inquiry committee, unique comprehensive legislation, private, it deals with private and individual property, because there was no communal property they needed to deal with, restitution entity with time frame for closure, publishing a list of names, and most important, active outreach, and an interest revaluation committee. Now we will watch for a couple of minutes a short video of the story of Peter Shechtman, the Peter Shechtman story, who, as I said, is an Australian citizen living in Australia. And afterward I will summarize.
Just thank you is not good enough. Deep in my heart, the work what they done, probably I will keep that in mind till my last days of my life.
The truth is that Peter Shechtman never thought he'd receive the fields that his father and his uncle bought in the area of Beit Yanai in the land of Israel. These were fields that were purchased before the Second World War.
הסיפור שלו מאוד ייחודי, כיוון שהוא בעצם היה כאן בארץ לפני המלחמה.
But only after the war, Peter moved to Australia and began raising a family.
It's already coming up 12 years since Michael's wedding.
Even here, thousands of kilometers away from the fields of the Sharon Valley in Israel, Peter never forgot all that was left over from those relatives who were murdered in the Holocaust.
After the war, my father tried to claim the land and was told that unless he settled in Palestine, it would he would be unable to do so.
Yet, after many attempts to return and gain ownership over those properties in the mid-70s, Peter began to sense that he had no serious chance of achieving that, so he stopped trying.
I give up the struggle. I've been sitting here miles and miles away, and I thought really that I lost the property.
One morning in 2010, an interesting letter was received at the offices of Hashava, the company for location and restitution of Holocaust victims' assets in Petah Tikva. It was this letter that actually reopened the case.
במקרה הזה מחלקת השבה קיבלה בקשה. כלומר, הגישו בקשה על שם יהודה שכטמן כלשהו מפולין, בן אדם אחר באותו שם. הבקשה הזאת נדחתה.
When the experts at Hashava were examining this case that was initially rejected, they were exposed for the first time to the attempts made by Peter to obtain the properties.
ומחלקת איתור יורשים מאתרת את הבן אדם באוסטרליה. מסתבר שהוא חי, ולא רק שהוא חי, הוא צלול, הוא זוכר את כל הסיפור.
אני זוכר מצוין את היום הזה שאני התקשרתי לאוסטרליה, לבן. השיחה הייתה מאוד קצרה, אני הספקתי רק לומר שאני מישראל.
When I heard about Hashava, that they interested in returning the value of money what's left from the property of my father and uncle, I was absolutely thrilled with that. Thrilled. But after all, I said, well, here you are. Justice is done after all.
Land properties and fruit orchards in the Sharon at a value of hundreds of thousands of shekels were then exchanged for money and as a result finally reached their legal heir.
שום דבר לא עצר בידינו מלבנות גשר מבית ינאי משנות ה-20 לאוסטרליה של תחילת מאה ה-21.
For the personnel of Hashava, this is a story that not only shows how the well-trained team knows the job,
אנחנו אלה שבסופו של דבר הבאנו סוף טוב לכל הסיפור. החזרנו את מה שהיה שייך לו ושהוא ניסה לקבל במשך הרבה שנים.
At the Shechtmans in Australia, no one could stay indifferent and unmoved in the face of this determined coast-to-coast effort to achieve a measure of historical justice.
I think it is a wonderful legacy. I sort of like to think of it as being some kind of connection to my grandfather and my great uncle and family that I never knew.
It's amazing. It's amazing what Hashava done. It's something, it's beyond my thinking. You see? To find me on the other end of the world, you see? And to return me what belongs to me.
Okay, we covered the need for Holocaust restitution in Israel, the Parliamentary Inquiry Committee, the unique comprehensive legislation, a restitution entity, time frame, restitution activities, the Israeli model, and Peter Shechtman's story. Before I end, I would like to say one sentence. Jestem urodzony we Wrocławiu, żyję przez wiele lat w Izraelu. Przez ostatnich 20 lat zajmuję się restytucją. Mój doktorat jest też o restytucji. Jestem gotowy doradzać i pomóc polskiemu rządowi w restytucji w Polsce. What I just said is that I was born in Wrocław, Poland actually. I lived for many years in Israel. I was dealing with restitution for the past 20 years and my PhD is also on restitution. I am ready to advise and help the Polish government on restitution. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. As you can probably tell, I do not come from the Eastern European legal tradition. I actually came into the field of restitution through actions filed in US courts by families whose properties were confiscated during communist regimes. My most recent experience with a couple of the other litigators here has been a case filed against Romania that's still pending. As many of you may know or probably know, the last 20 years in US courts have been home to a number of cases filed against foreign governments, their agencies, their instrumentalities, for restitution of property located outside of the United States, if there is a connection between that property and an entity that's using the property in the United States. These lawsuits aren't easy, but in some instances there have been successes. The most notable success is, of course, the one that Michael Basler talked about yesterday and Edna Kaplan mentioned today, the story of an elderly Jewish lady from Los Angeles named Maria Altman. She was successful in securing the return of 6 extremely valuable Gustav Klimt paintings that were stolen by the Nazis or expropriated by the Austrian state after the war. The story was, of course, dramatized in the Hollywood film Woman in Gold, and the American law allowing these lawsuits is what's known as the Foreign Sovereign Immunities Act, or the FSIA. And as far as I know, The Woman in Gold is the only movie where an American law is one of the heroes of a film. But the United States cannot and really should not be in the business of marshaling restitution regimes and problems of foreign countries. This is actually how I came to be involved in the work of a nonprofit called the European Shoah Legacy Institute. And for those of you who may not know, I didn't when I first started working there, Shoah is an ancient Hebrew word literally meaning calamity or destruction. And in modern times, it refers to the greatest modern tragedy to befall the Jewish people, which is the Holocaust. But ESLI is not a Jewish organization. It was created by originally 46, now 47 countries in 2009 to monitor and uphold the values of the Terezin Declaration. And I will discuss ESLI and the Terezin Declaration in short order, but I do want to note that, as Simon mentioned, I became the lead researcher and project manager of an immovable property restitution study that ESLI commissioned in 2014 to examine the achievements and gaps in restitution measures across all 47 countries, the most important of which which are those of Europe. And I'm happy to announce that the study will be published in book form by Oxford University Press, available next year. So here's the plan for the rest of my time. I want to take a few minutes to discuss the Terezin Declaration and its guidelines and best principles. They offer really important soft law guidelines for developing restitution legislation in a fair and impartial manner. Second, I do want to briefly discuss the work of ESLI and how its immovable property restitution study can keep the conversation about restitution in countries that still have gaps alive. And finally, while my esteemed panelists have offered excellent examples of restitution measures in many Central and Eastern European countries, I do have a couple additional countries that are neighbors of Poland in which they didn't discuss, where I'd like to highlight a few of the restitution laws. So first, the Terezin Declaration. The availability of an effective remedy is a really crucial aspect of restorative justice. And the stated scope of restitution in international law is return to the status quo ante, which means full restitution. Everything that was taken must be returned. But in reality, full property restitution is rarely achieved, and we are left with what a lot of scholars have termed a remedial shortfall. So we get partial compensation or none at all. In the context of World War II, mass theft went hand in hand with mass murder, and under communist rule, with nationalization came the confiscation of massive amounts of property. But for many, it's been really tasteless to consider or to think about monetizing these losses. And this notion arises from the misconception that somehow remedying property violations diminishes the memory of loss of life or the hardship endured. But the right to an effective remedy, as memorialized in Article 8 of the 1947 Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was a document put together sort of in the aftermath of World War II, reflected national sentiment that what was taken really must be returned. And during the subsequent 70 years, European nations have faced calls from home and abroad to return property to its rightful owners. And up until the last 20 years, there have been some wonderful achievements in restitution regimes, and then some work still to be done. So in the late 90s and early 2000s, there were many conferences, much like this, where people came to discuss work that's yet to be done. But unfortunately, hopefully what I don't wish to happen after this conference, not a lot of concrete principles came out of these late 1990s and early 2000 conferences that victims and heirs and survivors could use as tools to help achieve their effective remedy. So enter the Terezin Declaration. In June 2009, 46 nations got together in Prague and endorsed a declaration where they committed to continue to right the economic wrongs that came attendant with World War II, and in highlighting the importance of restitution of property as a key element of rule of law. The Terezin Declaration mentions a number of concrete benchmarks which countries can consider, or they ought to consider, when enacting restitution legislation. And these include a prioritization of in rem restitution, so actually getting the physical property back, or compensation when that's not possible, a process that's fair, comprehensive, and non-discriminatory, a process that is expeditious, simple, accessible, transparent, and neither burdensome nor costly. And these last points are particularly important when you're talking about countries that don't have specific restitution legislation, because when you have ordinary laws and you're using ordinary courts, the process is not impossible, but the process can become more burdensome, more expensive. It can clog the courts, and what that effectively does is sort of lock would-be claimants out of a restitution process completely, because they don't have the time or the wherewithal or the money to fight in the courts for 10 or 15 or more years. So the Terezin Declaration was passed in 2000, or endorsed in 2009. In 2010, a companion document, the Guidelines and Best Principles, were endorsed by 43 of the 47, now 47. Serbia was the 47th country to endorse the Terezin Declaration. So the Guidelines and Best Practices reaffirm the principles in the Terezin Declaration and add some additional concrete benchmarks for consideration for countries when they're passing restitution legislation. And it includes developments of solutions to overcome citizenship and residency requirements. As we've heard in these country presentations, there's been varying decisions by countries as to whether restitution should apply to citizens and foreigners. But the Terezin Declaration really encourages that it should be, regardless of citizenship, restitution should be available to all. Free access to archives, that a compensation process is sort of uniform throughout the country, so that you don't have one process that's really quick in one part of the country that's really slow or requires more documentation in another part of the country. And then finally, what's really important with respect to many Eastern European countries, the guidelines encourage that privatization programs don't compromise the rights of people who have whose property was confiscated during World War II, but at the same time that should be balanced with some kind of legal certainty for good faith occupants and purchasers of property in recent years. It's also important to remember that the principles in the Terezin Declaration are not just relevant and applicable to the plight of Jewish people or to some other specific targeted group. These principles of in rem restitution and fair and transparent process are contained in documents like, this is a mouthful, the UN Basic Principles and Guidelines on the Right to a Remedy and Reparation for Victims of Gross Violations of International Human Rights Law, the UN Principles on Housing and Property Reparations for Refugees and Displaced Persons, which is also called the Pinheiro Principles, and then also the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And so the Terezin Declaration and these other soft law documents are really just tools and roadmaps to help us get to an effective remedy for victims and survivors and heirs. So quickly, the ESLI Immovable Property Study. So when European Shogal Legacy Institute was established in 2010, its chief mission was to monitor countries' progress in fulfilling the principles of the Terezin Declaration. And to fulfill this mission, ESLI commissioned in 2014 an immovable property restitution study. The study is more than 1,200 pages long. It presents reports on 47 countries, and It compiles significant legislation and compensation passed by these 47 endorsing states since 1945 relating to the areas of private, communal, and heirless property that was confiscated during the World War II era and thereafter, in particular in the areas of Central and Eastern Europe. You had these double confiscations. You had targeted confiscation during World War II, and then you had blanket confiscation of everyone's property shortly thereafter. So whatever was returned was this time taken. Everybody's property was taken. So the report that was prepared for ESLI documents that there are experiences that are ubiquitous and universally applicable across the countries. And so for countries that are still sort of grappling with laws yet to be passed, there are lessons to be learned within the study. And this leads me to my final topic, which is restitution efforts in other countries. And I'll be brief. I know my time is short. We should be able to learn from the achievements and the difficulties from our other European neighbors. And for today, I just wanted to highlight certain aspects of the private property regimes of Hungary and Estonia. With Hungary, and I won't go into the background because I don't have time, but Hungary did pass 2 restitution laws in 1991 and 1992. And I would describe them as large in scope and narrow in remedy. The large in scope was good. The large in scope meant that it applied to Holocaust looted property, because you recall that Hungary was a member of the Axis powers for a while. So you had Holocaust era property and communist era property that was rolled into the legislation for restitution. But there were criticisms. There were narrow definitions of Hungarian citizenship. There was no in rem restitution. It was only compensation, and it's perhaps more of a symbolic compensation. There was a difficulty in obtaining necessary documentation. There was poor international notification, and as Aron mentioned, widespread notification is really important, and a lengthy claims process. But again, despite the challenges for Hungary, one of the really important things to take away from it is that it was so broad in scope, and it did apply to such a large time period that did include the World War II period. And then finally, so if we go a little bit further north in Europe and look at Estonia, for Estonia, the property was never taken by the Nazis. It was the Soviets in the early 1940s that essentially nationalized all property. And so from the early 1940s up until 1991, there really wasn't a private property scheme in the country. And after independence, the restitution law, the laws that were passed, one of the important elements of that particular law was it applied equally to citizens and non-citizens. And when we worked with the government of Estonia in preparing our report, they reported to us that so their restitution regime started in the early 90s, and by 2015, thankfully, they said that 99% of the process had been completed. But what was more valuable was that 230,000 people, Estonians, were eligible for restitution, and more than 13,000 foreigners, which shows that there is an appreciable number of people inside and outside of the country that were able to benefit from the legislation. So in conclusion, I guess a country's willingness to take concrete steps towards fulfilling the principles of the Terezin Declaration is a march forward and a march in the right direction to creating an effective remedy for victims of these these sort of dual atrocities and that happened in the 20th century. And our Eastern European neighbors have adopted regimes that incorporate certain values of the Declaration, the Terezin Declaration. And for Poland, I don't think it's too late. Their achievements can be replicated and improved upon with the benefit of hindsight of all of these regimes that have already been in place. And there can be a law specific to Poland's needs. Thank you, and I'm happy to answer questions during the Q&A.